5 children disappeared in a fire. No bodies, no bones, no teeth, no clothing, nothing. As if they never existed. And a family searched tirelessly for decades without any answer. The year was 1945. The war was finally over. America was breathing again. In the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, a family was preparing for Christmas. George Sodder had come from Italy as a young man with nothing. He had built a trucking business, a home, a life. He had married a woman named Jenny, and together they had 10 children. George Sodder was not a quiet man. He had strong opinions, and one opinion, above all others, had made him enemies. George hated Mussolini. Benito Mussolini was the fascist dictator of Italy. He had led his home country into war alongside Adolf Hitler. George said he hated Mussolini, loudly, publicly. In a community where many Italian Americans still admired Mussolini, this made George Sodder a traitor in the eyes of some, a man who was not loyal to his own people. A year before the fire, a stranger had come to the house. He was an insurance salesman. His job was to sell plans that pay money if something goes wrong. He looked at the house, he looked at George, and he said quietly, "This house will burn down, and your children will pay for what you say about Mussolini." George Sodder dismissed it. People say things. People make warnings about what they will do. Christmas was coming. His children were laughing. There was no reason to be afraid. December 24th, 1945. Christmas Eve. The younger children stayed up late, playing with their new toys. George went to bed early, tired from the long day. Jenny fell asleep on the sofa. Around midnight, Jenny woke to a sound. Something on the roof. A thud. Then silence. She went back to sleep. At 1 in the morning, the house was on fire. George woke to smoke, to heat, to screaming. He grabbed Jenny. He grabbed the 4 children closest to the door. They made it outside. But 5 children were still inside. Maurice, Louis, Jenny, Martha, Betty, on the upper floor, in their rooms. George ran back toward the house. The flames stopped him. He ran to the side of the house, where he always kept a ladder leaning against the wall. The ladder was gone. He ran to his coal truck. He thought he could drive it close to the house and climb up from the roof of the truck. The engine was dead. The truck had worked perfectly the evening before. Now it would not start. He tried a second truck. Dead. George ran to his neighbor's house to call the fire department. The phone line was silent. Dead. The house burned for 45 minutes. The fire department arrived 7 hours after the first call. By then, there was nothing left. Nothing but ash and silence. The fire chief looked through the ruins. He declared the cause: faulty wiring. Old electrical cables had started the fire by accident. He declared the children dead. He spent less time at the scene than it had taken the fire department to arrive. George Sodder did not accept this. He knew one thing that the fire chief apparently did not. Human bones do not disappear in a house fire. A crematorium, a machine designed specifically to burn human bodies, burns at 2,000 degrees for 2 full hours. And even then, bones remain. The Sodder house had burned for 45 minutes, at the temperature of an ordinary house fire. There should have been bones. There should have been teeth. There should have been belt buckles, shoe nails, toys. There was nothing. George hired workers to dig through the ruins. They found the springs from a sofa, the ceramic toilet, fragments of chimney, but not one fragment of 5 children. And then the witnesses began to speak. A woman who ran a tourist stop near Charleston said she had seen the Sodder children the morning after the fire, in a car, with 2 men she did not recognize. The children had looked at her. They had not called for help. Another woman said she had seen them at a hotel, being watched by a group of adults. A bus driver reported seeing the children on his route on the night of the fire. And then came the fire chief. Years after the fire, a local minister told George Sodder something extraordinary. The fire chief had confided that he had found something in the ruins of the fire. This was the same man who had closed the case in a single day. Something that looked like a human heart. It was not damaged by the fire. He had placed it in a metal box and buried it, without telling anyone. George demanded he show them where. The fire chief agreed. They dug up the box. A local funeral director examined the contents. It was beef liver, the liver of a cow. It had never been touched by fire. Rumors then spread through Fayetteville. The fire chief had not found it in the ruins at all. He had brought it himself and buried it in the hope that the family would believe it was human remains, that their children were dead, and that they would stop asking questions. And one more thing. After the fire, a private investigator discovered something that had been missed. He was hired to find the truth. He found out something that raised questions. One member of the legal group that decided how the fire was explained was the insurance salesman. The man who had given George Sodder a warning a year before the fire. The man who had said the house would burn had helped decide how the fire was explained. So what happened to the Sodder children? The authorities accepted the simplest explanation that said all 5 children died in the fire. They claimed that the heat was intense enough to destroy everything completely. House fires can reach very high temperatures. In some cases, when an upper floor collapses into a basement, the heat can become extreme. It is not impossible for bones to be severely damaged, even if it is very unusual for them to disappear entirely. But the physical evidence makes this explanation difficult to accept. A crematorium burns at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours and still leaves remains. The Sodder house burned for 45 minutes. Forensic experts use science to find out what really happened in a crime. They have noted that the complete absence of human material is extremely difficult to explain. This includes teeth, which are among the hardest substances in the human body. And yet, not one was found. This is very hard to explain as a natural result of a house fire. The second theory is kidnapping. This means the 5 children were taken from the house before or during the fire. The people who took them knew that the chaos of the flames would cover their escape. This theory explains many things. It explains why no remains were found. It explains the cut phone line, the missing ladder, and the disabled trucks. It explains why multiple witnesses reported seeing the children alive after the fire. And it explains the strange behavior of the fire chief. This theory is also consistent with the warning given to George Sodder. It raises the possibility that powerful people were involved. People with connections to the Italian-American community that George had made enemies of. In 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, Inside was a single photograph. It showed a man, perhaps 30 years old, looking directly into the camera. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 4 words. Louis Sodder, I love brother. Louis Sodder, if he had survived the fire of 1945, would have been 32 years old in 1968. The family hired a private detective and sent him to follow the lead. He traveled to Kentucky, where the investigation appeared to be pointing. He was never heard from again. He never returned. He never sent a report. He simply disappeared. No one has ever explained the photograph. No one has ever found the detective, and no one has ever produced a body, a bone, or a piece of evidence conclusive enough to close the case in either direction. George Sodder built a billboard on the road outside Fayetteville, large enough to see from a passing car. On it, the faces of his 5 missing children. The billboard stood for years. George Sodder died in 1969. He died not knowing. Jenny Sodder kept the billboard standing. She kept writing letters. She kept asking. She died in 1989, still not knowing. The case has never been officially reopened. The 5 death certificates still list the cause of death as fire. No one was ever charged. No one was ever questioned. No investigation was ever conducted beyond that first single day. A photograph arrived in 1968 with no name and no explanation. A detective disappeared following the lead. And somewhere, in the ruins of a house or in the decades that followed, the truth about 5 children went with them. Thank you for listening to B1 English Mysteries. If this episode kept you up at night, good. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next shadow.